Bonjour, the Generati. It is the MMA RAXPOD for UFC France. UFC Paris featuring Ciryl Gane and his opponent Serghei Spivac. All right, that's enough European slander. We respect all cultures and creeds on this show except for the British. Welcome to the MMA RAXPOD, folks. We're coming off another winning weekend at UFC Fight Night, UFC Singapore. Could have been a big, much bigger winning weekend than it was had a certain split decision gone the correct way. But I am a man that atones for his mistakes, and we'll get into that in due time. This is going to be a much quicker show than last week. Not only because I went for over 2 hours last week, which was a RAXPOD record. We did have 11 fights to talk about. But as you can tell, if you've been following on Twitter this week, I've only got 4 picks for this event, which is an all-time low. I believe the previous low was 6, and that resulted in a clean sweep at UFC Vegas 78. However, for the sake of building parlays, having only 4 fights to play with is not great. And if you've followed how I do my analysis in terms of picking and choosing my spots, you can kind of understand why that's the case this week. There are only 4 men's bouts on this card featuring a pair of combatants that have previously competed in the UFC. I can tell you with full confidence that is the lowest number easily since I want to say when Luque fought Jeff Neal. So I'm not sure that was Fight Night Hill Santos. So when Jamal Hill knocked out Thiago Santos, which was in August of last year. So by the time this event happens, it'll have been over a year ago. As I'm recording this, it's within the same month of a year ago. It is the last day of August, about 1:30 in the afternoon here in Miami. And I'm going to breeze through this intro as I can to go over the losses from last week. Even though it was a winning weekend, I have 2 quick favorites that I want to account for that did not hit. And then I will move on to the quadrant of analysis for UFC Paris. 3 favorites and an underdog. So I will also go over how I plan on allocating my units this week, given it's a bit unorthodox to how I typically do things. And as I didn't really lean on much last week, I am profitable for the rest of the year. So I can, for my own sake, I can go a little bit nuts with it. But for the public's sake, I do want to ensure a more safe return. So for this week's purpose, given I only have 4 picks to play with, we'll find a bit of compromise in terms of unit allocation on the typical 10 unit per card budget. That being said, let's get into last week's greatest flaws, of which one was much more significant than the other. That fucking Ryan Spann decision is just going to drive me nuts, man. It did at the time, and I had to, really take a moment and just be like, I had a winning event. It's hard to be upset, but to lose out on 3 parlays, especially after that Nakamura Garcia thing cashed, which was really just like a YOLO play, but still the numbers were telling you that Garcia was going to survive. So at those odds, you had to take a chance on it, and I would have a 5-leg parlay attached to that if they gave Ryan Spann the recognition he deserved for the damage that he did to Anthony Smith. Smith wasn't the one taking backward steps in the 3rd round. Or Spann wasn't. Smith was the guy that was still eating the brunt of the damage, even though he was more active. But they even showed in the post-fight stats, it was almost half of the significant strikes he landed were low leg kicks. And if we're valuing damage and we're not seeing Spann, get wobbled by them like he was in the first round in terms of losing his balance, you're really going to reward Smith for those little love taps in the late stages of the third round, while Spann is the one that is more actively trying to finish the fight with strikes to the head. It was disappointing to see. The thing that made me really nervous a little bit, even despite the strong grade I had on Spann last week, was when Smith started taking shots at Alex Pereira, because I recognized that, oh, great, now if he somehow wins this, if they stir up a beef, that's suddenly an easy lamb for Uncle Dana, as he's so called, to offer up to Pereira for slaughter as, because they have this guy hanging around as a perennial 5'10" light heavyweight contender for some reason, despite the ineffectiveness he's shown now in 2 fights back-to-back. 3 fights if you want to count when he got injured against Ankalaev. Anthony Smith should not be heralded in that sense, but for promotional purposes, the UFC can use him to throw at Pereira to legitimize his credibility as a light heavyweight. And guess what? Guess who gets a greasy split over Spann? Despite nearly getting his eyes shut in between rounds and having the doctor check on him and shine it. That was a little sus when the doctor shined the flashlight in his eye for that long. It was like, dude, that can't be good for him to have that kind of beam going through it for that extended capacity. Like, I thought that was going to hinder his performance, to be honest, but he didn't seem to get wobbled in the third the way he did in the second, to his credit. I see why it was ambiguously scored in the third round. I still maintain that there was a better case for a 30-27 for Spann than there was a win for Anthony Smith. I cost like 30 units in terms of potential winnings. And it turned what was a profitable weekend, or it made a profitable weekend out of what could have been a lucrative weekend, so to speak. So I'm really just looking at it as a bad decision, although because in the price, it was a great price because Spann's fight IQ issues were kind of baked into the line. So it was hard for me to look at that based on all the other variables that were in favor of Spann and not look at him as a potential leg. I'm glad I made the hedge because I was getting a little bit cold feet about Junior Tafa. Ultimately, I decided the age gap was going to play out as history says that it does, and we all saw what happened. So I was glad to lean on Tafa as a leg, despite him being a more unproven commodity. History prevails, as opposed to Spann, who once again showed some fight IQ issues he's displayed in the past, but I think most people, if this went to decision, myself included, would have expected Spann to still be the superior performer, especially given so much of Smith's success in his MMA career was based on finishes. The last 2 fights have been a third of all the fights in his MMA career now that have gone to decision, I believe, which is bewildering for a guy that has had over 50 fights at age 35. So it's really an anomaly. I still think Spann won. He wasn't recognized as such. It is what it is. It's interesting that I don't think you should be surprised if if Pereira ends up fighting Smith, especially because Pereira is now actually calling for that himself. And at this point, Smith will probably do whatever he can to stay in the limelight of the UFC as a legitimate fighter before pivoting into his commentary gig that is waiting for him, as I have to imagine the UFC is wanting him to lean into at this point as opposed to continuing. So if he wants to go on the pyre for Pereira, I'm sure Dana White will probably give that to him, because at this point, what other realistic option do you have for that guy given where he holds himself at? He didn't win that fight. I don't care if you bet on him and your ticket cashed. It was a bad decision. But listen, since that fucking Albazi Cara France blunder that I was miraculously shown some grace on, I've been talking a lot of shit about decisions as it is. And that streak I went on, I don't forget that it started in part with Mr. Jack Jenkins being shown some grace on the scorecards himself. So I've been a benefactor of it before. I still profited last weekend thanks to Mr. McCall Alexiouge, who showed the brand lots of love on Twitter, and very grateful. He liked all my parlays like a few hours before he went out and put Cheaty down. Like that was crazy. He was eating some hard kicks. He ate one clean head kick that wobbled him, and he was still able to just pull it together so quick and recover. I wonder how much that like bugged Cheaty out when he like didn't put him away with that, and he was able to recover as quickly as he did, because he was, I believe it was some uppercuts, but you saw him get into the clinch and was landing better shots to the head where fists were involved. That's a classic example in MMA terms of, kicking super great, but at the end of the day, the hands are king. And you saw Alexiouge, even in a pick'em situation, really excelled with that. So I'm glad I made him a pick. But I was very optimistic about Span, just as I was about Alexiouge, and you see how the confidence can go in either direction in terms of results. So that's why it's often the correct reason to hedge. As for the other favorite miss that I had, I believe that was Holloway TKZ. I took the plus 2.5. That fight got to the third round, and it didn't get through the final half of what we needed to cash. And it didn't do that because TKZ came out in the third round and said, you know what? I ain't going to win this fight unless I just go bananas. So I'm going to go bananas right now and just leave it all in here. And he did. And that's why everybody loves him. And I was saying, as I got emotional last week, saying we would get an emotional fight, and we got 10 minutes of just swanging. And everybody, and I said TKZ was going to have his moments of success, but it was going to be evident Holloway was the superior guy, as the line indicated. And the narrative coming out of the first round was, we've never seen Max so rocked. Oh my God, the Korean zombie still has it. So I think my read was mostly correct, but the lesson that you still need to take out of this in terms of hedging on an over is, if you know the guy is in an obvious retirement situation, which he was, because he said he was going to retire after he lost to Volkanovski last year. And then he decided it would be better to do this more appropriate retirement closer to home. And it got to be a better send-off. I mean, everybody was very thrilled with the walk-off, or the walkout, obviously. So the line was not appropriate to bet on Max, even though he was clearly the guy. Still got wobbled. You lay 800 on a guy, you don't want to see them get rocked like that. But I still felt good about that clearing. But I didn't put it on anything other than the moonshot last week just because I knew it wasn't really a fight that was worth investing much in. So it was a miss, but it's a miss that I'm taking with a grain of salt. It is just another interesting thing I'm factoring in going forward into fights where there's an aura of retirement, because it's just going to make me more firmly not want to get involved on an over in cases where the guy's been finished in the past and doesn't have a rep for being a survivalist, or just picking the guy outright on a money line that is facing the retirement conditions. So I know people will point to Robbie Lawler, but over a long-term capacity, having the bug of retirement in your head is generally not conducive to MMA success. So that's enough reflecting on UFC Singapore. Let's catch a flight from Asia to Europe and touchdown in Paris for UFC France. It's UFC Paris, but I don't know. Like, it should be a different thing every year, at least, because there was a UFC Paris last year on like almost the same date. So Ciryl Gane was the main event too back then. He's got a bit more of a dynamic opponent this time, though. He actually finished the opponent that Gane had last year as well. But we'll get into that a bit later, because right now we need to talk about the first fight, which is Farid Basharat and Clayton Rodriguez. Basharat had looked pretty good against Damon Blackshear. And, everybody was gassing up Blackshear heading into the Batista fight, given he hit the twister on Jose Johnson a few weeks ago. But it's funny, you go back and watch that fight that Basharat had against Blackshear, and it's interesting that it ended up being a 29-28, because that third round was largely dominated by Basharat. I talked a bit about that fight heading into Blackshear's fight with Batista a few weeks ago, and how Blackshear was a bit overconfident in his ability to trick Basharat, and Basharat was able to see through the deception in a way where he was able to secure takedowns. And even though Blackshear at one point had Basharat in the same twister position he had Jose Johnson in, Basharat was intelligently able to reverse himself out of it and recover in a way that he was still able to win the rounds. Now, the reason Basharat lost the third round is because he, in the final 10-15 seconds of the fight, was caught in a very tight arm triangle. No, I don't think it was an arm triangle. It was an armbar attempt. But he didn't tap, but it was secured in enough that people were making a ruckus about it, and the judges, in seeing that it was Blackshear who was more near to ending the fight in that round relative to the control that Basharat had prior to that, they gave the round to Blackshear, which made the fight seem a bit closer than it actually appeared over the entire 15 minutes. So Basharat really had a much more impressive victory by decision than that would indicate. I do still think he's front-running a bit here, only because we haven't seen him win by decision yet in the UFC. The Blackshear fight was the only fight he's had beyond the Contender Series, and on Contender Series in September of last year, he also went to decision. So you generally want to see a fighter win by at least knockout or submission, as well as a unanimous decision before feeling outright confident in laying this kind of juice on him. But the get back here is that Clayton Rodriguez is moving up in weight, not necessarily by desire, because he had been previously having good success at flyweight. But this is a guy who also, in you think about his greatest level of competition he's had in the UFC to this point, despite the finishing success he's demonstrated at a lower weight class. And this is a guy in Rodriguez who wasn't able to beat CJ Vergara. And you have to wonder, looking at that result, if Damon Blackshear were lined against CJ Vergara right now, who do you think would be the favorite? Regardless of what the line would end up being, who do you think would be the favorite? And so you compare the hurdle that Basharat has already cleared compared to what Rodriguez has failed to go beyond yet, even if he's demonstrated finishing prowess. And that has to make you feel better about Basharat's ability to implement his own game plan in a weight class he's already comfortable with, as opposed to Rodriguez entering a new arena despite the experience he already has, but not being able to clear necessarily the same quality of hurdles in that time as Basharat has. So I liked Basharat when he was closer to minus 300 flat earlier this week. I do think the finishing upside of Rodriguez keeps him from being like, an outright 400 favorite. So if it creeps out to there, I don't think he becomes playable. And as the week has gone on, he's gone out to 350. So if it adds another 50 points onto that by the time the fights are teeing off on Saturday afternoon, I would just let Basharat moneyline go at that point. Because that's a pattern that we've seen with these Basharat brothers, is they even their juicy price tags, they just get more and more tagged onto them as the close comes in. So we'll see how Rodriguez does with the weight, given the issues that he had at flyweight. But I do like Basharat here. He is going to be my first pick. I believe he will stay undefeated. So give me Farid Basharat. I'll say he does it by decision. It would be impressive if he could get a finish, but Rodriguez himself is pretty durable. This is a good fight. I'm looking forward to it, and I wish this was further up on the main card. I think it's kind of ridiculous that there's so many fights that don't feature two combatants that have previously competed in the UFC that are further up on the card, but it is what it is. This is one of the lower effort events they've put on of late, so we'll get through it as able. The next fight is Ange Loosa and Rhys McKee. I haven't seen much enthusiasm for McKee on the betting side this week. I've seen a lot of combat sports fans picking him, which I think is interesting relative to, I think just that maybe it's the clash in styles. Obviously, McKee's going to be more of the striker that you want relative to what Loosa offers. And Loosa did cough up the second round to A.J. Fletcher and nearly got finished on the feet, but was able to avoid doing so. And ultimately won the first and third rounds to get the upset. I believe I made a Fletcher a leg that night, so it was kind of devastating to watch the ship go down. But that was an interesting night for a lot of reasons. That was also the night that Romanov lost his undefeated record to Marcin Tybura after 10-eating the first round, but not being shown that on the scorecards. Anyway, Loosa hasn't fought since that night, so it's been over a year, so ring rust is a bit of a concern here. But the interesting thing for this guy, even though he does have the rep of being a hard hitter and certainly the physique for it, you wonder if the technique is quite there, because he's gone to decision in 6 straight fights. But that's an interesting thing relative to McKee, because McKee has never won a fight by decision. He's only gone to a majority draw. That's the closest that he's ever gotten to winning. Otherwise, in every other instance, he's lost. So McKee does have a bit of finish or bust quality to him, and Loosa is not someone that has been knocked out. or finished or subbed. So he hasn't been. He's not been finished in any of his losses. So if you're betting on McKee, you are inheriting the risk of, if this fight goes the distance, you've put your money down on a fighter that has never won the fight on the scorecards. So I think it's very possible that McKee has like the more effective first round in terms of striking, but Loosa ultimately is going to have the more well-rounded martial arts fight in a way that he's able to control McKee in the way that he's shown historically to suffer or I shouldn't say suffer, but fall short in the highest levels of the sport. This is a guy that hasn't won any of his UFC appearances, even though he's made a bit of a comeback here. So I know he's very eager to prove himself, but this is a tough task against an opponent that is a bit more experienced than him just relative to success, if not length of tenure, and is more well-rounded and hasn't been finished, doesn't have the same attrition as what McKee is bringing in here relative to the success that McKee needs to have to find a win. So I feel very, very confident in Loosa here. I called him at 170 earlier this week. I've seen it come down. He's at like 159 right now, so we'll see what goes on at the weigh-ins. Especially because I saw someone share a picture of McKee, and he does look a little bit gaunt. So you have to be so worried about his chin, and Loosa hasn't shown the knockout power quite yet in the UFC, but this is a guy whose durability is there. He took Jack Della Maddalena to a decision, so he's a tough guy. He out-wrestled him for a little bit, even though he wasn't able to really keep him on the mat effectively, and Della Maddalena did show good get-up, but my goodness, like that said something at the time, given how Maddalena was running over everybody. And we just haven't seen much of Loosa since then. But he did have a underdog show-out performance against A.J. Fletcher, who was largely expected to beat him at the game that Loosa ended up showing better ability in terms of wrestling and grappling. So I think that even though Loosa striking is going to be a bit of a concern relative to what McKee offers, McKee's chin is just not going to be conditioned for getting hit by guys at this level that offer the power that Loosa has. So this is a tough one for McKee. I would say Loosa is my most confident pick for the value that he's at this week. In terms of pure confidence, I would say Basharat is, but I mean, it's kind of cheap to say that a 350 favorite at this point is your most confident pick. So relative to the price that he's at, I would say it's Ange Loosa. So give me the man from, I believe, the French Congo to give a decision post-fight interview in which he speaks some French to the respectful crowd in France. So the next fight is Benoit Saint-Denis and Thiago Moises, the Frenchman, Saint-Denis. It's interesting. He was one of the first fights I taped last year when he was I shouldn't say one of the first ones, but I believe one of the first events I put out picks for on MMA Rax was Benoit Saint-Denis, Nicholas Stolze, and I believe I put the over out in that one. I graded Stolze to win, and I didn't feel confident in it, so I decided to hedge on the over, and Saint-Denis just completely wiped him. It was bad, but Stolze ended up not really proving to be UFC caliber anyway. He got knocked out by, I believe it was Jared Gooden. So that kind of leads to my point in terms of I hate going out of the way and declaring guys, especially guys that are fighting on the main cards of these UFC events. It feels wrong to, from my lofty perch here in downtown Miami, lording over the MMA community of South Florida as I do, casting judgment from my loft of the downtown. So ridiculous. But listen, Saint Denis hasn't won a fight by decision yet in his MMA career. He just hasn't. So you have to be a little bit concerned about that. And he's fighting a guy in Moises that has gone to 10 decisions himself. I just wonder if people are rushing a little bit too much too soon. And the interesting thing is when you track the train of opponents here, you see how the front runner effect kind of carries through lines almost. Because I'm taking it back to the start of this year when Terrence McKinney was the favorite over Ismail Bonfim. Bonfim gets one of the knockouts of the year with that flying knee against the fence on McKinney. McKinney ends up having to spend the remainder of the year up to now cleaning up his image with a finish over Mike Breeden after getting submitted by Nazim Sadikov. And I believe McKinney's now looking for another fight. But then Bonfim went off of that fight as like a 300 favorite against Saint Denis. And Saint Denis ended up proving that line was a complete joke and dominated Bonfim. Now Bonfim now Saint Denis is the favorite against a guy who has 3 times as much UFC experience as him and has gone to decision 10 times more and is much more successful. There's no shame in a loss to Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos, but it was a level up moment for the guy. And now this is his next level up moment. And he showed in the level up moment, albeit his UFC debut, in a difficult environment with a referee that borderline nearly got him permanently damaged. He showed incredible tolerance in that fight to the point where I wouldn't expect Moises to get a submission win. But I don't think it's out of the question given the level of ability the guy has. There's many people that have professed that the guy is a higher level jiu-jitsu specialist than what he's perhaps gotten to demonstrate in the UFC or has had to at this point. So I just think on a card where I only have 4 picks and I don't want to be going all chalk, I do feel good about going with the guy who's shown more experience in other areas relative to the guy that, even though he's fighting in the friendly confines of France, hasn't necessarily put in the experience against the more proven commodities yet to where you feel good about him taking down an established UFC veteran like Moises, who has still expressed desire to regain ranking at the highest level of the sport. So I'm going with Thiago Moises. I'll say he squeaks by decision, but I'll say that he also gets the fight to the ground and I think kind of surprises people in a way where he gets to showcase a lot of his skills that he hasn't necessarily got to put on in previous fights. And again, this is a guy who really, like, the only attrition he's wearing is from guys like Makhachev. I mean, Moises is being a little bit disrespected here, I think. I'm surprised that he is not favored in this matchup. But again, it's a Frenchman fighting at home, so you can kind of understand it. But I would be surprised if he got the finish on Moises here. That would really, really show something, and I think would absolutely vault Saint-Denis into the rankings. So give me Thiago Moises, my only dog this week. I feel pretty good about it. And now we come to the main event. Ciryl Gane and Serghei Spivac. There's a lot of narratives on each side of these fighters going into this, so I want to set the record straight for each of them. But I'll start with Spivac because he's one of the first 30 fighters that I built an analysis for when I started doing this. And I picked Greg Hardy to beat him that night. Ooh, that wasn't so good. So I've come a long way on Mr. Spivac since then, obviously. And that reflects that how he has come a long way in the UFC as an individual himself. It's interesting. You go to his Tapology page, it still says that he fights with the Polar Bear team, I believe, in Macedonia. And he's got another oddly specific camp listed on his Wikipedia page that when you try to click the reference for him competing there, it takes you to a page that tries to give you a computer virus through a Norton pop-up, a fake one. So that might want to clean that up, folks. The truth is, if you go look at his UFC interview from leading into the Derek Lewis main event at the beginning of this year, Mr. Spivac, since sometime around the Jared Vanderaa fight, has been living out of Las Vegas and training at Extreme Couture, which is a better gym than what Ciryl Gane is operating out of, by the way, but we'll get to him more later. Anyway, my point is, Spivac came into the UFC as a bit of a doughy commodity and, lost an interesting decision to Marcin Tybura, which it's interesting when you look back at that because Tybura had 8 minutes of control time, and that was as early as 2020, so like 3 years ago. And Spivac also lost his UFC debut by first-round knockout to Walt Harris. He's also been knocked down in the first round by Tom Aspinall, so it has been shown that his chin isn't really there and isn't that good. You don't want to say that he doesn't react to strikes well, but he certainly, at least if you're able to hit him hard enough early on in the fight, he's shown that he can go down. Now, first round knockouts aren't necessarily Gane's specialty, but neither is grappling, as some of his holy shit, his recent fights have exposed. And even it may be a little bit overstated because obviously, people have made a lot that, the two guys he's lost to are Ngannou and John Jones. So how can you short rate him that much in terms of well-rounded skills? But Spivac has made his name on a lot of his groundwork and his grappling, which have both, if you're able to excel in those departments in this weight class at heavyweight, there's often so many shortcomings in that area that you're really able to find a lot of success. That's largely why he's been able to dispatch fighters like Derek Lewis that are a bit too one-dimensional, not enough well-roundedness in their skill set. But then you look at a guy like Tom Aspinall, who is well-rounded in the skill set and has the athleticism advantage, and you look at that fight and what he was able to do to him only 2 years ago in a situation where it was evident who was going to have the striking advantage between the two, but was still viewed as a striker-grappler matchup in which the striker had the presumed edge. Spivac not only got beat, but if you look at how he got beat, the bulk of where Spivac has had his success in terms of takedowns has been with the little judo throw hip toss that he does that is highly effective and often results in slamming effect takedowns, which create big impressions on the judges, particularly with any ground and pound that are landed afterwards, and often set you up for just immediately falling into advantageous places like side control, as opposed to a traditional takedown in which you might just go directly into top control or have to evade a guillotine before moving into half guard. So Spivac does really good setups, but in the Aspinall fight, he went for the hip toss. Aspinall recognized where he was going for it and stuffed it, and Spivac kind of got frozen up in terms of not really knowing what to do or breaking out of it when he realized he wasn't going to get it, or it was apparent he should have let go. And for that frame, Aspinall hit him with the elbow that just totally collapsed him and ended the fight. So even though there's fight IQ questions for Gane that we're going to get into, there you still have to wonder that if Gane, even though the takedown defense edge here certainly goes to Spivac, if Gane is able to recognize and stuff that takedown attempt in the same way that Aspinall was able to recognize, what with his athleticism advantage, what is he going to be able to do that? And what does this fight look like if it does stay on the feet for the duration of however long it lasts? Spivac's developed his hands. He's got a piston of a jab. The striking discrepancy here, I think, is a bit closer than people are making it out to be. But the difference, obviously, is the athleticism and the agility for Gane is just there in a way that Spivac has, really had to grow into his body and is now more getting the most out of it, entering his prime, as opposed to Gane being the established commodity he is that can go compete with, ferocious human beings like Francis Ngannou and John Jones. So you compare that to what Gane has been through, it's important to contextualize that. But in taping this, I was very confident on Gane with my initial read, and then I wanted to make sure that my confidence wasn't misplaced, especially after last week, in which I felt very good about Ryan Spann and recognized that there were some fight IQ concerns, but was still willing to absorb that risk. This week it's a little bit different, but I think that there is a pattern in terms of you see more things that weren't necessarily there on the initial read that make you more concerned from a fight IQ perspective. If you go watch the Tuivasa fight again for Gane, one thing that you'll notice is that he did spend a decent portion of the fight fighting with his guard down, and it speaks to how confident he is in terms of being able to control range, which I would expect him to do in this fight with Spivac as well. But you just generally don't want to see that from a fighter because it's how they can get set up for taking an easy shot. And he did get dropped by Tuivasa in the second round of that fight, even though it felt like he won all 3 rounds even prior to finally getting the finish on tie. But he did kind of stall on getting it because there were many different points in which he was hurting Tuivasa visibly, and instead of pressing forward for the finish, he wanted to be a bit more of a showman and, acknowledge what Tuivasa was talking back to him and then, in the third round, as the leg kicks were, or not the leg kicks, but the body kicks were getting really bad. Tuivasa was a bit more expressive in terms of showing the damage he had and doubling over and whatnot. But Gane, I like a cerebral finisher, like a John Jones finisher, will just see that and not wait. They'll just go pounce and feed off of it. And you saw Gane just kind of smile and laugh with Ty, knowing like, oh, I'm the big favorite in this fight for a reason, and I'm having a show in France and I'm enjoying it. That's not the way that John Jones would approach that at all. So you kind of see the difference in terms of in-ring psychology and that contrast. And stalling is it's just not a good thing that you want to see. So the further fight IQ issues come from the Jon Jones fight, which showed the most major thing that we saw from Gane that we haven't seen, I don't believe, in any of his previous performances. And that's that Gane gave up his back to Jon Jones. Bad. Now, he didn't do it, deliberately, but he overswung, and it was funny because my favorite moment of that whole fight was that little awkward step that Jones took in which they were kind of feigning, or I don't know if one of them just struck and missed, and I think Gane evaded out of range, but then it was at the point where Jones was like kind of showing his ass to him. And at that moment, I mean, he was kind of giving Ciryl a free shot at him. Like, because he's like, there's nothing realistically I can do here other than try some dumb spinning back shit or like a mule kick. But like, you're rangy enough yourself that you could like, just literally kick me in the ass or crash in and jab me or something while protecting yourself. Like, I'm not in a position where I can realistically react in time to do something to you. And Gane just didn't do shit. And so Jones spun back inside and reset position, and then they went back to it. And then shortly after that, Gane overswung, and Jones crashed in and took Gane's back, and we saw what Jones did about a minute later. So Gane taking his back and then kind of taking a nap against the cage were both not good things. So between the guard and the giving the back and the fouling, which we saw in the we've seen a bit of a pattern of fouling too across some of his fights, even though he hasn't really been called for it yet. But you remember the groin kick against Jon Jones to start that one out initially. You don't want to say that he's sloppy because he really is a polished striker, even though I don't think necessarily given the credit for having the sting on his strikes that he deserves. But Gane otherwise has every single statistical striking advantage here, as well as the height and the reach by 3 inches. If this fight stays standing for its majority, he's not going to lose. He's going to control the range. If he controls the range, Spivac doesn't get the takedowns he needs to win this on his terms. So I wouldn't be surprised if this goes to decision, which would, I think, aggravate a lot of people. If it does go to decision, you can't imagine that the French are not going to give this to Gane, regardless of how close it is after 5 rounds, and if Serghei has had like 3 rounds of control and Gane hasn't shown an ability to get up but struck well for 2 rounds and did enough damage in one of the other ones that it's ambiguously given to him. Otherwise, the striking on the feet is going to be Gane's to lose. If in this heavyweight fight you're wondering who's going to knock out who, Spivac has the piston jab. He throws an overhand right that he's not very accurate with, though. And we'll see him throw combos in the same, like, maximum chain that, like, Gane does. But Gane's clearly got the volume striking edge. And he's the more polished defensive striker. And he's going to have the tools to control the range and the better agility in the stand-up. So, between that and the fact that he's fighting in France, I feel reasonably good about picking him. There are an abundance of fight IQ concerns I have for Gane that I don't have for Spivac. And that is why, between that and him training at a better gym, I don't think it's a bad case for betting him as an underdog this week at all. I'm just doing what the numbers are telling me to do relative to what else I've seen in my own technical analysis. And the thing that jumps out to me is this guy's not only got all the advantages in the stand-up, but he's also got less attrition. He's only been submitted by Jon Jones. He hasn't been knocked out the way that Spivac has twice in the UFC. He's got more experience going the distance, and he's had more success when he does so. And he's done it at a higher caliber of competition than what Spivac has had success with. And he's going to be doing it in his home country, where he won the main event a year ago under similar conditions. So, give me Ciryl Gane. I think what I'm going to end up doing is doing a 5-unit parlay that's Basharat and Loosa and Gane. And then I'll do another 5-unit parlay that is those 3 plus Moises. Just a bit of a YOLO this week, but, in consideration of me being consistent with making units off of 3-leg parlays, and given the lack of other picks this week, we'll go with that. But that's going to do it for the RAXPOD this week. 50-ish minutes for 4 fights, I think, is pretty good. I know I was a bit quick with some of them in there, but I got nice and into it for the main event, I think, is what most people want anyway. So I want to thank you very much for tuning in. And I'm going to be back next week for what I'm definitely knowing what the event next week is. Definitely do. It's circled because my hero, my former boogeyman turned hero, is in the main event. The guy that put down Abus Magomedov on my enormous winning streak, the hero of the MMA community, Sean Strickland, is going to get put down so bad by Izzy next week. Oh, God, it's so gross. And now I'm looking at this card, and I'm like, what the hell? Oh, my God, the Justin Tafa-Austin Lane rematch. You already know I'm on the under for that one. Oh, that should have been on the winning streak, too. I hope Tafa's eyes recovered already since then. That Volkov Tuivasa fight, though, that's going to be a banger. I'm looking forward to that. And Tyson Pedro, we'll see how he does. Carlos Ulberg should be on the main card, not Tyson Pedro. Get out of here with that. Anyway, I'm sure the Australians are thrilled. Jamie Malarkey's on here again. That'll be funny, grading him against John Makdessi. My Aussie accent is not anything close to what my British one is, so I don't think I'm going to be doing any Aussie jokes. I have great respect for one of the most impressive coalition of shit posters the world has ever seen down under, so I'm looking forward to the card next week. But until then, we've got a whole weekend of college football to look forward to, and I've got to turn my attention towards that. So thank you very much for tuning into the MMA RAXPOD, and we will be back for UFC 293 next week. Until then, g'day, mate.